You may or may not survive. Assimilation is a very big problem for them, as it is for any ethnic group. I mean, who knows who's Irish anymore? Who knows who's Italian? And do people want to preserve that sort of thing? And okay, the Hispanics are more pronounced at the moment because there are a lot of people from Hispanic background, and the assimilation process hasn't completely progressed. And the same with Vietnamese, and same with other ethnic groups. Probably even people from Middle Eastern background and so on. Depending on how many generations they've been here, how far they assimilate. Japanese is a really good example because old Japanese, different generations, I think they were called, Shinsai, Nisai, these sort of names that they had for the different generations of Japanese people here. I mean, by the time the third generation, they were totally Americanized in many ways, which is what was so bad about the experience in World War II. But new Japanese people coming in, all the new restaurants and other kinds of enterprises that are opening up, a huge wave of new Japanese young people have entered this country, whether they're here permanently or just temporarily. So that's another assimilation problem. They're not at all like the Japanese generations that have been here for 2 or 3 generations. And I don't even think their reason for being, they are probably still in a state of flux. They still question who and what they are, whether they want to be here, whether they're going home to Japan, whether they're just making money in order to buy a house in Japan, or what it is that they're doing here. But I don't think that the old Japanese population, particularly this area of the country, had a very good number. Where I live in Fountain Valley is a Japanese community. That's really what it is. It was a Japanese farming community, and I think I told you all of the schools are named after Japanese war heroes there, and most of the good land was owned by Japanese, and some of them are still very, very, very prosperous as a result of some of the land holdings that went on there. Some families like Sakioki, I think, and some other different families own large chunks of property down there. So Fountain Valley was actually a fountain. It was actually, there were springs underneath the ground there. That's why it was called Fountain Valley. It wasn't some real estate agent's come-on dream or something like that. Anyway, the point for the Jews is, in America, is how many are going to keep on, how many are going to join the melting pot, not just culturally, but in every other way. And of course, the key comes down to the holidays. It's really odd that the key is the holidays. I mean, and of course, the biggie of all biggies is Christmas. Nobody has a problem with Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving is a wonderful national festival of the American people, and everyone can join in. And a lot of people don't realize that we have Abraham Lincoln to thank for that holiday. He's the one who proclaimed it. It wasn't the Pilgrims. He proclaimed it after, I think it was after the victory at Gettysburg. He thought there should be a Thanksgiving for all the casualties and all the grace that God gave this country to survive. And I think that, well, I was telling someone the other day that for me, Lincoln is like, okay, he's got defects and weaknesses like everybody had, but he's a very depressed individual in many ways, but he's so large in the history of this country, and his personality is so large, his persona, because he had no petty small aspects to his person. I told these people the other day, telling a Lincoln story, that I like to do these things because I think it's important to get into other parts of culture. Tolstoy writes about Lincoln, and apparently, Tolstoy was in the Russian army for quite a while, and he writes some books about his experiences out in Central Asia and the steppes of Central Asia, and he, was with the Cossacks down in the Caucasus and place, and apparently, he was down with some, tribesmen in those areas, and they were asking him, tell us stories about the great men. Tell us stories about the great men. So, you know, that people, oral traditions like stories. And apparently he writes this. He says, okay, I told them about Jesus Christ. You know, trying to think who the great men. You know, I told them about Julius Caesar. Told them about Napoleon. And I said, no, you've missed the great liberator. We want to hear about Abraham Lincoln. And he was like, why? He was totally amazed, you know, that this would come in the steppes of Central Asia. But when you think of it, I mean, I do historical Jesus. I want to close this a bit because it's going to get a bit chilly on you guys, if you don't mind. At least you don't.
I don't mind at all.
Yeah, it's going to get chilly on yours truly. I teach the historical Jesus and things like that, and you know, there's a lot of issues in terms of how historical we can deal. Not so much maybe that the person involved, but the material that is presenting itself as giving a picture of what he may or may not have been like. You know, the historicity of that kind of thing, how retrospective, how real it is really a very huge problem, and it has been for some 200 years. And I hope my new book has some effect on that issue. But forgetting that, so that's a quasi-historical, almost supernatural figure. I mean, that's a man god. He's presented as a man god, and you know, a supernatural being. He can do marvelous things, like come back from the dead and walk on waters. And so there's a lot of you know, supernatural aspects to that presentation. So if you set that figure aside, you know, who really is the most famous human being in history? Abraham Lincoln is way up there. Someone said, oh, Mahatma Gandhi. Yeah, maybe, but only recently. I'm not sure how long that's going to last. Martin Luther King, we think a lot about in America because of recent issues in America, but I think over the long haul, you know, Abraham Lincoln is quite likely to stay up there, very high up. Not that it's a race or anything, but that's a titanic human being figure. So Thanksgiving, you know, I think none of us have a problem with that. We all love that holiday, and we love the spirit behind it. You know, one wants to give Thanksgiving for the goodness that we receive here, whatever our problems are, or whatever we feel the shortcomings of the society is, and so on, and however, whatever short end of the stick we've received. We know that somewhere else. I mean, I've just heard a description of the streets of Baghdad. I mean, the killing going on there is just like endemic. One group killing another, trying to get them out of neighborhoods. There's not a street safe. There's not anybody. No army could any longer keep it safe. It's just deteriorated into a state of nature. And that's not all America's fault. That's also the attitude of the people towards each other and how they, you know, the guy was saying, a New York Times correspondent, he just left there after 3 years. He said, I've been to the morgues. And they not just kill each other, they drill holes in each other, you know, they pour acid on each other. You know, it's so gruesome. You know, you think they're just killing neighbors. No, they want to make them suffer. You know, for some reason I have a fascination with drills. All the bodies have drill holes in them, he said, you know. And so this goes beyond anything, you know, American as such. We may have triggered it, but the point is that there are things here in this country to be grateful and appreciative. So we have that spirit. So Christmas is the biggie as far as assimilation goes. Either you're going to participate or you're not. And for Jews, I think that is the big barrier. Big barrier. I don't think Buddhists feel it so strongly. You know, Christmas is something even Japanese people in Japan enjoy celebrating because they like holidays and they like shopping occasions and things like that. So. I've heard that even Tokyo is decorated, the department stores, for Christmas and things like that. You know? And it's something that they like to get into. But for the Jews, this is a serious problem. So I think you can determine who is a Jew just on the basis of whether they're celebrating Christmas or not, frankly. You know, if they're not celebrating Christmas, they're still a Jew. If they are celebrating Christmas, they've packed it in. I know it's a dumb gauge, but I don't think there's a better one actually to test someone's commitment, because to resist Christmas it takes a lot of effort, particularly when everyone is enjoying themselves, getting, you know, into the spirit of the holiday, shopping, you know, and mistletoeing and all these different things. I mean, you know, that takes a certain amount of steadfastness. It was, well, why resist? Well, you know, it's what it symbolizes to them. You know, I think the destruction of a lot of things that they held dear. I think the triumph of Greco-Hellenistic Roman civilization in many ways. But that's another class and another day. It's not for this class. So I think that the American scene is going to more or less, you know, I think that the numbers are not going to increase, you know, in America. I think that just to look forward to the future, intermarriage is the big issue, I think, for a lot of cultures and for Jews, Arabs, Asian groups too, I'm sure. The whole thing about intermarriage, should I marry one of my own ethnic background, or should I marry someone else, an Anglo, an Italian, or something like that? These are serious issues for your offspring and your ethnic identity and so on in the melting pot. So where the Jews go, I mean, intermarriage is fine, but which culture is going to dominate? What are the offspring going to be? And that's where the you know, push comes to shove. And it takes a lot to resist the Christmas wave for young people, unless you've got a commitment. I think the Jewish people are doing pretty well where that goes. The intermarriage is turning, I think it can replenish a people too. And the problem with Judaism, it's not just a religion, it's a religio people. It's both a people and a religion to some extent. If you just call it a religion, that's one thing, but it's also an ethnic identity. It's more like the Hindus in a way, where you have a huge civilization that is Indian in the sense of Hindu Indian I'm talking about. Which is both a culture and a people. And so I think India, of course, is a very varied country. So. But Israel is the lodestone. If Israel really goes under, I don't think most Jews in the modern world will have whether they support Israel or not isn't the point. It's the effect Israel has on their being, that they can have some sense of security in the world. Not that they identify with Israel or anything like that, that, you know, they know that there is one place that people are, you know, surviving. So you say, oh, Israel's racist, Israel's this. Well, yeah, of course it is to a certain extent, in the sense that it feels it has to survive as a Jewish identity. So if it just becomes a democracy like every other country, you know, and the birth rate determines who's going to be the majority, that is going to evaporate anyway. So what was the point of the whole experiment? You know, so it isn't that it's racism. It's that's how it's, the simple presentations of it are. It goes much deeper than that. You know, the identity, it was supposed to, and that's what we're going to study here. It was supposed to be the place where Jews had sovereignty, control of their own destiny, control of their own fate. So the Palestinian issue is terribly important, terribly important. I don't have the answer, frankly. I like Palestinians. I've always liked Arabs. I studied Islam. People say, oh, you know, you don't sound like it. No, I don't like people chop people's heads off, but or are gruesomely cruel for no reason, you know, just for cruelty's sake, who enjoy torture and things. No, but I don't think that's all Muslims or all Arabs by any means. Most of the Arabs I met were quite noble. However, when the situation gets out of control, like it is in Iraq or it can be in the Palestinian territories, should that ever develop, some people can become carried away with their behavior. So it does become a problem in terms of your feeling. But the point is that, you know, what is going to happen with that situation, with the Arab problem? And I think Herzl understood it, would have solved it, or at least would foresaw the solutions. But he wasn't allowed to survive. And we'll see the great tragedies that occur. I think Herzl would have saved maybe half of the Jews that perished in the Holocaust, frankly, if not more. It's always a shame to rewrite history. You can't rewrite history. But, you know, there's so many things that contributed. I was watching, I think I mentioned it to you folks previously, and it's very important. something about Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt was a very great president of the United States and so on and so forth, and did a lot of things for social security, social welfare, you know, stopping the collapse during the Depression and so on and so forth. But from the materials that I have encountered, he was no intellectual titan. And basically he was kind of, we don't realize it now, running on his relative's name to some extent. That's really how he kind of got going, you know. Teddy Roosevelt, who we don't know much about because we've forgotten him, was so popular in the late 1890s, early 1900s. People don't realize how popular he was. You know, and how forward-looking he was. You know, he was a trust buster, a monopoly buster, and stuff like that, although he believed in, you know, talk softly but carry a big stick and things like that. And, you know, Franklin Roosevelt ran for 4 terms as president. You know, which was unheard of prior to that time, which is why the Republicans, the minute they got a majority under Eisenhower, passed a constitutional amendment that a president can't have more than 2 terms. It's all directed against what Roosevelt did and their hostility and anger about Roosevelt. But I don't think Roosevelt was the man that is, not his ancestor, he's a cousin, a couple of times removed of in the previous generation, but someone he knew quite well. Was not the original person that his earlier progenitor was. And Teddy Roosevelt was a really original person. Well, what happened was he was so popular that he could have run for a 3rd term. I don't even know if he did more than a whole 2 terms because he came into office when someone else was shot. I think it was, his president, I think at that time was McKinley. McKinley was assassinated and Roosevelt, they put Roosevelt in the vice presidency to warehouse him to get rid of him because he was too troublesome a person. Like he'd been governor of New York just like his descendant Franklin Roosevelt became. And they didn't expect him to become president, so I don't know if he had a full 2 terms or not, but for some reason he thought he shouldn't do more than Washington did. Washington was the example. Washington, after 2 terms, went home. Maybe Washington wanted to go home, you know, maybe, you know. But he felt that he made a promise that he shouldn't go for a 3rd term. So he left the presidency at such a young age when a lot of other men would have just been beginning. I think he was not only was he the youngest president, I think. I don't know if that's been beaten by people like Kennedy, but I don't think it has. But he was also the youngest retiree from the presidency. You know, he was, George Bush Jr. seems young to us. I don't even think he was as old as, I think he was older than Teddy Roosevelt was when he began his presidency, when Roosevelt left his presidency, if you understand. Roosevelt was young, younger than Bush was when he began his presidency, and we think of Bush as rather young. So that's how young he was. Well, he put this man Taft in, and I think the year was 1908 or something like that, after 8 years had gone by, and he was so popular, Roosevelt, that he could have easily won a 3rd term. And then Taft turned out to be a very conservative, do-nothing, poor president, someone who betrayed all of Roosevelt's programs and, you know, cooperated with the trusts and all this sort of thing. And Roosevelt was horrified. He went over, traveled, and then he came back, and he was so angry he ran against Taft in 1912. And because he split the party, he actually got more votes than Taft, because the party didn't like Roosevelt, I mean, any more than the party likes McCain now. The Republican Party didn't like Roosevelt, they thought he was too progressive. He had this party called the Bull Moose Party, and plus someone shot him, and he almost died. He was, you know, he was an inch away from death, a little, you know, and so on. So he made it possible by running against this Taft for Wilson to get in. And then Wilson tempered and tempered and tempered on the First World War, and didn't, you know, it took him years and years and years to finally make the decision to send the American troops over in 1917 and so on. That's 5 years into his presidency, etc., the 2nd term. And Roosevelt was just horrified. And then, you know, apparently I think the next election was 1920. If he had run in 1920, which he could and would have done, he would have easily won. Well, I assure you, first of all, Teddy Roosevelt would not have allowed the First World War to occur. He was involved in the peace between the Japanese and the Russians. He believed in the big stick policy. There would have been no First World War with an American Navy out there doing the kind of things that he wanted it to do. And we wouldn't have gotten into the scenario for the Second World War. And we wouldn't have had a Holocaust. We wouldn't have had a Holocaust because the Second World War, they blamed everything on the Jews. The Nazis came to power after the Treaty of Versailles and thought they'd got a raw deal, and the Jews became the scapegoat and the enemies and so on. This is something which we read. Even the First World War wouldn't have happened. But even if the First World War did happen, if Roosevelt had come in 1920, no Hitler would have been able to rise like that. But you say, what happened to him? Well, he went away on a trip to the Amazon after he was just one of these crazy guys who liked adventure and, you know, to challenge his masculinity. He went up the Amazon and he almost died. He got all kinds of terrible sicknesses. He destroyed his health. And then to top it all off, his favorite son, a man called Quentin Roosevelt, died in the very end of the First World War. He was a pilot. He'd gone, you know, the American Air Force. He was a pilot. He loved this boy, and he was shot down and killed in late 1918. And Roosevelt didn't survive him by many months because he blamed himself for just, you know, glorifying these things and this boy's death. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. And I'll tell you one last story about the whole thing since I'm on this subject. I know of what could have been. The reason I think it's so important is the Holocaust. The Holocaust. What could have stopped the Holocaust? You know, peace in our time. What's the British Prime Minister's name that came back with that slogan when he spoke to Herr Hitler? What was his name? Huh? You know, the British Prime Minister. That was his name. No, Churchill.
I don't know it. Churchill. One I know.
No, Churchill was against Hitler.
Thatcher. No, I'm kidding.
This is way back in 1939.
We had Chamberlain over here.
Chamberlain, that's the one. Chamberlain's the one. Yeah, thanks. You know, my brain is going to mush in certain areas, but not all the areas. So, what a lot of people don't know is that Theodore Roosevelt Jr., another one of his sons, was a general in the American Army at D-Day, and he was the one who landed on the beach in D-Day and organized the assault that broke through the German defenses on the beach at D-Day. He was on the beach, literally on the beach. And he got a heart attack 3 weeks after the landing and died on the beaches of Normandy. That's another tragedy in the Roosevelt family. So that's just so interesting if you're interested in history to look into these things. So it's a tragic story, the Theodore Roosevelt. For this country, in many ways, because you see people idolize Wilson, but Wilson was a horrendous racist. You know, he loved this idea of you know, 12 points and, you know, I forget all the things he was marketing overseas and his, you know, different things about the League of Nations, and then he never could even get it passed in this country. But he was a Southern Democrat. He was a Southerner who was president of Princeton University, and he actually didn't think the blacks should flourish. He was against the blacks flourishing in the United States. And he reintroduced, or he actually introduced segregation into the American Army. It was he that put segregation into the American Army. You know, something that we, you know, had to spend another 30, 40 years to get rid of. And it was because he was a Southerner. He was really into the Southern cause. And he'd gone north and got an education and became, you know, academic and so on, but he never gave up his Southern sympathies. And the black Afro-American, however you want to refer to that particular question, was something that he was very, very negative on. And to my mind, that's a tragedy. Wilson gets a lot of credit, but I would give him very little credit, given the other parts of his character and the things that he did here. And of course, the mess of the League of Nations certainly brought Hitler on. It wasn't totally his fault, but in any case. All right, so we're talking about accidental things that cause things to happen. So we're in a situation where, we have the Jewish people, as far as other Jewish communities go, Hitler really did, unfortunately, an incredibly effective job in what he set out to do. Nothing deterred him from what he was doing there. And he erased huge swaths of people, very talented, probably people, some people could have contributed an awful lot, music, science, physics, who knows how many Einsteins and Freuds and other kinds of people were eradicated. It just boggles the mind when you think of the people who, for no reason, were treated that way. For this insanity that we had. So where are the Jews? I mean, there's a certain number in England, but that's not a very flourishing community. France is going through a tremendous spate of anti-Semitism now with the Arab immigration into France and focusing on the Jews. And a lot of Jews are being forced, not by the government or anything, but just by the situation in the neighborhoods to leave, to go to Israel and other places from France. So that's not a very flourishing thing. There's hardly anything in Germany. A little bit reconstituting itself, nothing in Poland. There's a lot of the Russians are under tremendous pressure. Some went to Israel, and that's this new party. And there's about 1 million or so Russians in Israel now, from the new Russia. I mean, Russia since World War II, when they opened the gates, over 1 million Russians and Jews left. There were only 3 million left to begin with, so we don't know what the situation in Russia is going to shake out. But a lot of the Russian Jews left to come to America and to come to Israel after World War, after Glasnost and the refuseniks that were making protests back in the 70s and 80s. So that changed the situation in Israel, because an influx of 1 million Russian Jews into Israel. There's no immigration going on to Israel to speak of basically since the 1970s. And then suddenly 1 million Russian Jews come in. That really added an awful lot of extra strength that people don't realize, population-wise, is there, which is another interesting phenomenon to keep an eye on. Recently there was a change in government, and the guy who's in the Russian Immigrant Party was taken into the government just 2 weeks ago, if you follow politics, because the prime minister there, who's very unpopular and made a total mess of everything we saw in the last 6 months, is fighting for his survival. So he had to make some deals with the Russian Immigrant Party, who are totally against his policies, don't like his policies on the West Bank, don't like any of his policies. Don't like the fact that he withdrew from Gaza, don't like any of these things, but because they want some power, they were brought into the government, and Israel government works through power sharing. So that's another interesting phenomenon. So what we're doing now then is to see what were the elements that went into this state of Israel that brought it into being, the different thought processes and philosophies and currents of thinking. So the first one I want to look at, and we'll just use this book, The Zionist Idea, because it's quite a good collection of texts. We're stuck with there. I'm sure there are lots of other texts we could use, but he's done a fairly good job. I think we should look maybe at Kalischer first, because he's a little younger, 1795 to 1874. Alkali is 1798 to 1878, and I think Kalischer here is someone who is living in Eastern Europe and is not. I don't think he's a Sephardi. He's Sephardi background. He would be more in keeping with the situation that we're looking at in Season, in Reformed Judaism, and so on. So you can read. There's a little capsule description of him and his background. I don't know. You still got the same page numbers I have, 109 to 110. You have that 109 to 110. You have that? Yeah. There's a pretty good. So I don't really have to read that to you. I guess he was from the more Russian area of activity, though these nations weren't totally constituted the way we have them now. His career, as he says, coincided with the rise of Reform Judaism in Germany. But you see, he really isn't of that mindset, being further east. Apparently he wrote a letter in 1836 to the head of the Berlin branch of the Rothschild family. You know, Jews were still using Schutzjude, permitted Jews, rich Jews, to express themselves through. And this is pretty, you know, an attempt to get them involved in trying to help transplant some of these suffering masses. You know the poem on the Statue of Liberty? Give me your tired and your poor, your wretched masses yearning to breathe free, the tired refuse of your teeming shores, etc., etc., etc. That was written by a New York German Jewish woman who was watching the teeming masses of Jews coming into America from Eastern Europe. That's what she was. Celebrating or expressing. Both her pleasure that America would open its doors to some extent, and the horror at seeing what they looked like, you know. Yeah, that was, I forget what her name was, but she wrote that poem watching these Jews from Eastern Europe coming into America. So he said, of course, what is quoted here, and I think it's important to take a look at that, the beginning of the redemption, speaking of redemption, will come through natural causes by human effort and by the will of the governments to gather the scattered Israel into the Israel into the Holy Land. So this is what year he writes that? This is already, you know, not anything like season. This is 1836, about exactly the same time these guys are changing the prayer book and doing all the other stuff in Central and Western Europe. They wanted to, he wrote another work, Seeking Zion, in 1862, and he'd already was quoted in this other work we're going to look at, Hess's Rome and Jerusalem. Apparently he was well off, and he was instrumental in setting up a group to buy land for colonization on the outskirts of Jaffa in 1866. So that's the year after the American Civil War. He's already, how should we put it, putting his money where his mouth is, using whatever wealth he had to actually buy land. You say, well, how can you buy land then? Well, this was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a huge enterprise. You could go and buy land in the Ottoman Empire should you want to. It's not stealing anyone's land. It's just paying a fair market price. And there was this Alliance Israelite Universelle, which is very important, which was created in 1860 in France, and was owing to his prodding that they established an agricultural school in Jaffa in 1870. That's why I'm taking him first. So here's a totally unknown person. You say, well, what's an agricultural school? To teach Jews how to do agriculture. And of course, that's what Israel's been most successful at doing, through the kibbutz movement later on and so on. So, you know, he's not doing this other stuff, working with prayer books and all these. He's doing very practical things. And trying to get this Universe Alliance Israel, we'll hear about it again, but, you know, when Herzl goes to Palestine, I don't even know if it was called Palestine then, this province of the Ottoman Empire, and he had tried to see the Sultan of Turkey and so on. He tried to see the German Kaiser, etc. The German Kaiser received him, the Sultan of Turkey received him. And then the German Kaiser was going to visit Palestine. I think it was in, I don't know when, somewhere around, you know, 1899 or 1897 or 1900, somewhere. Herzl died in 1904, so sometime before he died. Sometime after the Dreyfus trial. when the German Kaiser landed in Palestine and went up to Jerusalem, if you want to call it that, for a pilgrimage or a visit or whatever he was doing there. Maybe he was also fostering German, influence in the Ottoman world, because the Germans were very strong in the Ottoman Empire by this time. They were building railroads for the Ottomans. They helped build a railroad down to Mecca. They were building railroads in northern Syria and eastern Turkey and so on, and the British were watching them. I don't know if you've ever heard of the famous romantic character Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. He was a very interesting person. He went to Oxford University as a student. He was from a illegitimate background of a British aristocratic person who had relations with his housekeeper. So he was always embarrassed about his origins because she wasn't the first wife of this person, and she had been the housekeeper or something like that. And in England, these things really matter. Class is very important. And so he was always embarrassed about his origins, why he kept trying to change his name. But he had, British aristocratic background, but on his mother's side, this huge embarrassment of not being married and also, not being, of a proper social standing and so on. But, he was one of these very bright boys, and he did go to Oxford. He was a local boy in Oxford. They were living in Oxford, so he didn't go to the colleges and all this stuff. And he did very well, and very interested in archaeology. And then he was sent out. Some of his Oxford dons, they're called, teachers, spotted him, sent him out to Syria to a dig where one of the famous British archaeologists was carrying on at Carchemish, which is in northern Iraq, northern Syria. So he was out there for 5 or 6 years helping, working with the Arab work gangs. This would be around, 1907, 1908, 1909, and so on and so forth, perfecting his Arabic, being involved with local Arabs. They say that there was some homosexuality there, and that may have been part of his involvement with the local things. It's a huge romantic story I won't bore you with, but there's been a movie which is totally romanticized and inaccurate, but it gives you some of the outlines of his career, but not this part of his career. In any event, the reason I bring it up is one of the things he was doing at Carchemish was watching the German construction of the railroad in the Ottoman Empire that was going right by Carchemish. He was a British intelligence officer already from his Oxford days. He had already been, spotted by his professors, and not only was he doing archaeology, but under the guise of archaeology, they were doing intelligence work. So it's just interesting. That's how he got his start, watching the German railroads in the Ottoman Empire and sending reports back to England, and we were very concerned about this kind of thing. I can tell you the whole history of Lawrence sometime if you're ever interested, but I don't think we have time for everything in this class. I certainly diverged enough as it is. So anyway, Herzl met the German Kaiser on his visit to the Holy Land. I think this was all part of the same configuration of things that were going on, the German influence in the Ottoman Empire. And then when the First World War came, the Ottomans came in on the side of the Germans, much to their chagrin. And, places like Iraq and Syria and all these places, these are all provinces of the Ottoman Empire. There was no Iraq, there was no Syria, there was no Palestine, there was no Lebanon. These are just what are called sanjaks, provinces. And Iraq wasn't even a whole country. It was 3 different provinces, the way it should have been today. The mess we have today is half of it is trying to keep a country together that has no inherent, what's the force in the nucleus that keeps things together? No inherent fusion attraction force, only what the British bequeathed to it, and the British were hated. So the British created this Iraq thing out of nothing, out of 3 provinces that they took after the First World War. These are all called Ottoman successor states. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, not Egypt. The British disconnected Egypt from the Ottoman Empire much earlier. When the Suez Canal was being built with French-British money, Disraeli, the British Jewish prime minister who had converted to Christianity in order to climb the greasy pole as its father converted him, and was Queen Victoria's favorite prime minister, he was a novelist too, like Herzl. He wrote novels before that, before he became prime minister, and he wrote novels about going to the East and romantic novels about, Palestine and different things like that. So when the opportunity came to buy the shares of the Suez Company, he bought them all up. So that's how England got control of the Suez Canal, because the French company went bankrupt. And Disraeli was prime minister who had this interest in the East, and he bought them all up in the 1870s, I think it was. All these things are interesting coincidences, but Egypt, this was a country that had a certain amount of independence in Napoleon's time. And Napoleon went in there and invaded that country and tried to disconnect it from the Ottoman Empire, and to some extent succeeded. But then he was driven out by the British at the Battle of the Nile when they sunk his whole fleet, and then he ran ignominiously back to Paris and left his whole army to collapse there and become British prisoners. So the British helped set up an independent Egypt back in the Napoleonic period, and it was run by local, but the Mamluks in Egypt had been somewhat independent since the 1200s when they stopped the Mongols. We had a Mamluk dynasty in Egypt going all the way back to, and so that was the upper class. Mamluks, you might be interested to know, the reason we call them Mamluks, mulk in Arabic is property, and Arabic is three-letter roots built up like Hebrew on the base of three-letter roots. So Mamluk means someone who is owned. In this case, owned by the state. The Mamluks were slaves who were levied in places like the Caucasus and in the Balkans, sold into slavery for Christian children mostly in Egypt, and brought up as an independent janissary corps of political military rulers whose only allegiance was to the state. A crazy thing, somewhat based on Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic had been translated in these parts of the world. So, history is a great thing. We don't give enough history courses in this university. And I don't even think we have the personnel to teach the history courses that we need to give, but I won't get into that. I haven't kept abreast of it. But I know that Middle Eastern history has been sadly lacking, and I would love to teach a lot of this stuff, but I can't teach everything. So I have to restrict myself to what I did teach. I did teach Islamic religion and culture and civilization. Started that course I taught it for 25 years here. Never had any trouble with any Muslims or Arabs in that course. In any event, the Mamluks were semi-independent under the Ottoman Empire from the 1200s. The Ottomans hadn't even come yet, but they made a deal with the Ottomans, came under them, but they weren't totally under them. So Egypt was semi-independent for a long time, and then with the Napoleon period, it even got more so. And then you had these local Egyptian kings, King Farouk and people like that, who were the product of the British situation with Napoleon, which is a pretty weird thing developing. So Egypt wasn't an Ottoman successor state. So when did the British take a hold of Egypt? Well, they bought the Suez Canal, and then they wanted to protect it. So around the 1880s, they just took it over and put their governor in there, and that's it. Made it a British colony. They just moved in. I don't know what date within the 1880s, but somewhere. And then they had a sort of a local person as a puppet king that the British governor controlled. But the British were in Cairo from the 1880s onwards, and basically around the country. So that really wasn't, they did that to protect the Suez Canal that they had bought. They wanted the passage to India. You know, to go to India, it's like going out to California from New York. Back in the gold rush, they had that program on television last night. You know, you'd have to go around Cape Horn to get to California. Is that Cape Horn or is that Africa? What's the one in South America? The one down there. I mean, it was an 8-month voyage from New York to California. And terrible, terrible weather down there in the south. So they used to land the ships in Panama, and then they'd have to hike across this very jungle-infested sort of area and pick up a boat on the other side if they survived yellow fever and malaria and all that. That was the other way to get here by sea. Other than that, you had to come 2 miles a day in a covered wagon, 2 miles an hour in a covered wagon. You know, which itself would take about 4 or 5 months. It just depends which way you wanted to do it. And Mike freeze to death in the Donner Pass. In any case, they wanted this. You know, we did the Panama Canal for the same reason. I think Teddy Roosevelt again, but the British, you know, needed the easy way to India, and they were going to protect that with all the force at their disposal. In any event, these countries like Syria, Jordan, Palestine, they were provinces in the Ottoman Empire. And Palestine wasn't even a province. The province was Syria, and then Jerusalem was a kind of independent entity because of the holy sites and the Christian pilgrims that would come, so they made special arrangements for Jerusalem. But Palestine was not a province of the Ottoman Empire, period. The British set up Palestine because they've been reading Roman Greek history, and they like, you know, the Roman name, and they were all classicists in the civil service, so they called it Palestina, you know, Palestine. But the Ottomans never called this Palestine. There wasn't even a Palestinian identity before 1918. You know, and a lot of people just don't know anything about the history. And the British and the League of Nations, Mr. Wilson's gift to us, set up these mandates. America never joined, so then the British and the French had total sway in these things. And they carved up the Middle East between them, and they had French got a mandate for Lebanon and Syria, and the British got mandates for Palestine and for Iraq. However, and they got Kenya and a few other places. You can look at the mandate scheme if you want from the Versailles Treaty, and the Palestine Order in Council was 1922. I have a book on this subject. It's called Islamic Law and in Mandate Palestine and Modern Israel, shortened Islamic Law in Israel, in Palestine and Israel, which I wrote for my PhD dissertation, and that's out from Brill, and I think it's probably in the library here. But I discussed the whole mandate set up in that book. I have to learn it all myself. Palestine Order in Council was 1922 when the British actually set up the government in Palestine as a result of getting the mandate from the League of Nations, which they engineered for themselves. They made a deal with the French to divide these areas up that they'd taken from the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire became Turkey, and then they disconnected all these provinces. So how did Jordan get there? The British decided they didn't like the situation in Palestine, which was in both, the Palestine Mandate was on both sides of the river, and included Jordan. One of the points that people don't realize, because of the propaganda and all the, you know, it's just all the wash of complete absurd opinions that you hear of really uninformed people. They don't realize that there was no Jordan back then. The British set up Jordan themselves, and they carved 2/3 of the Palestine Mandate out of the Palestine Mandate and gave it to the royal family of Jordan, because the royal family of Jordan were the people who had cooperated with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And they weren't from Jordan, they were from Mecca, and they'd been kicked out of Mecca by the Saudis. So the British felt an obligation. So they took the family from Mecca that had helped them in the First World War to some extent, that Lawrence had cultivated and promoted, and they gave them Jordan and Iraq. They put one of the sons in as king of Iraq because the French had kicked him out of Syria. His name was Faisal. He was later killed by Saddam Hussein's predecessors in the 50s. His whole family was wiped out. He was king of Iraq, and his name was Faisal. And he's the one in Lawrence of Arabia. How many have seen the movie? He's Faisal that you see in the movie. They made him king of Iraq, ultimately. And then they took the other, his brother Abdullah, and made him king of Jordan. But in doing that, they created the Palestine problem. Because in the mandate for Palestine, from land from the Mediterranean to the Iraq borders, there was enough territory to solve the Arab-Jewish problem. There was enough territory, but they took 2/3, almost 3/4 away and gave it to another family who's been quiet ever since because they know that they were the biggest profiteers of the First World War, and put the whole Arab-Israeli or Arab-Jewish problem onto what we now call the West Bank or the west side of the Jordan River. So how are you going to satisfy the national aspirations of two peoples in that little territory? You were never going to be able to do it. And so you got them killing each other ever since. But the point was that if you wanted to make a deal or if you wanted to settle the problem, you had a huge territory to do it in. You know, how you worked it out isn't my issue. But the point is that, you know, there's not room for 3 states between the Iraq border and the Mediterranean Sea. Yet that's what we've come down to, 3 states. You know, there was only room really for 2, an Arab and a Jewish state. What you wanted to call the Arab state was up to you and up to the Palestinians and up to whoever was involved in it. But the British created all that, and the British created the Iraq problem too. And, you know, America goes in and picks up the pieces, but, you know, we're not good at picking up pieces. You know, we had to pick up the pieces for the French in Vietnam. Look at the mess we made out of that one. So we're not good at picking up pieces for anybody. And unfortunately, you know, this is what we're still doing, and we don't have a clue how to get through this mess. And we probably won't get through this mess very, very, very well. Anyway, so, you know, what you hear about the Zionism, Israelis, Jews, you know, none of this ever had to happen. None of this ever had to happen if there was anything rational in the process, and if people didn't do things that were, you know, politically oriented and inappropriate for what they had been granted. They were granted the mandate for Palestine. They were never granted the mandate to carve Palestine up as they saw fit. And the Balfour Declaration was, and we'll talk about the Balfour Declaration, was attached to the mandate for Palestine. Okay, so I don't want to go into the history any more than that. I give you a bit of the history. As you see, we're still in a total mess. But let's go back here. Kalischer then was instrumental in encouraging Jewish agricultural enterprise and actually set up a school. So when Herzl went to Palestine with the Kaiser, because Herzl was German background, after all, coming from Austria. It wasn't totally a German state. It was an Austro-Hungarian Empire, but still it was German-speaking. And met the Kaiser. He stood outside this agricultural school when the Kaiser went by and greeted him, tipped his hat, and the Kaiser tipped his hat to Herzl, and that's where Herzl was standing. That's symbolic. Herzl was standing outside this agricultural school, which had been encouraged by this Kalischer chap, who no one's ever heard of. So that's why I take him first. It says he was aware of the growing misery of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and a lot of people respected his Talmudic learning, as he says here. We had this situation in Palestine. And this is very important for, if you want to understand what the situation that developed there. We had, this is fun, this is actually today, I think. Maybe you'll learn a bit, or maybe you won't, I don't know. It's a pretty superficial sketch, but it might get you more interested in it going further. We had what were called Tzadikah Jews. Does anyone know what a Tzadikah Jew is or might be?
Does it have anything to do with study?
By the way, you want to put a date on that and mess around? What did you say?
Does it have anything to do with the study?
No, really not. Except that the root is, as you say, ZDK, which is righteousness. Tzedakah means to be justified. It's a verbal noun from fourth form causative verb, since you're doing some other languages, you guys. Semitic language is fourth form causative verb, and it means to make righteous or something. So with the fall of the temple, charity was considered the way to make you righteous or to show that you were a pious person. Charity was called in Hebrew tzedakah. You gave charity, you gave contributions. So tzedakah Jews were Jews who lived on these contributions that were collected all over the Jewish world in synagogues and other places. That's why Jews are so instrumental in giving money to politicians and every other cause. Everyone goes to the Jews and basically, I don't say shakes them down, but knows there's money there that they're willing to give, where a lot of people aren't really interested in giving money to anything. But they always, politicians and others know there's always money there. And my daughter works for a charitable organization in New York at the moment, a Jewish charitable organization that was set up at this time to help these kinds of refugees. It was called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to distribute this charity. And she said, Dad, you wouldn't believe how charitable people are. The amounts of money that they give to our organization it even like boggles my mind. You just can't imagine, what people give. Not for Israel. It's not for Israel. This is to rescue Jewish communities in India or in Ethiopia or in Russia or in the Balkans or old folks' homes in China. There are Jews in China who have no support. They have old folks' homes in China, and things like that. Just to mention, she said you just wouldn't believe it. And it is surprising because I'm not a big giver to charity, so I don't feel like I have enough to contribute. But there are a lot of people who do this, and they're taught. You see, this goes back for 2,000 years. Part of what the Romans, and there was a big thing about Nero the other night on History Channel. Well, part of what the Romans were involved in, they wanted the Jewish charitable contributions to the temple to go into the Roman treasury. That's one of the big things Nero was interested in, because they knew the Jews from all over the Mediterranean world were giving money to the temple, part of their expression of their Jewishness. But that's also would be an interesting thing to trace down, the Roman attitude towards Jewish charity giving to the temple. And of course, as I point out in my book, and I think it's quite clear, ultimately, when they took the temple, I think that was Nero's plan all along. He goaded them into revolt in 66. He needed the money for his building projects in Rome after the fire. And he was building huge, like totally, can't get the right word, but overwhelming building projects of the most richest splendor that he was doing. And he didn't have the treasury to do it. He goaded the Jews to revolt, sent very cruel governors out there. And before he could win the war out there in 68, he committed suicide perhaps, or he was killed. It's not clear which. But in any case, he was forced to commit suicide or he was killed. And then the generals came in, and then the general in Palestine, Vespasian, got control of the empire. He was the general Nero had sent out to Palestine. And the first thing he did was bring the temple treasure back to Rome. So I think he was just carrying out Nero's program, frankly. And what did they build with it? What was the big thing that the Flavians built to entertain the Roman masses, to divert them from any sort of trouble or, like we have sporting events, the Colosseum. This temple of death and destruction and torture and every other thing, complete, what I would consider, we glorify it now because we're so ignorant. But we say, oh, what a great building, and look at all the things that they did there. Yeah, look what they did there. Totally sordid, maniacal, I can't even get the right word, disreputable, low entertainment of the most vicious, bloodthirsty kind, blood sports. This is what they did with the Jewish temple money. And the slaves they took in the revolt to work on it. This is what the Flavian family did. So I think they just went on and carried Nero's building project. Nero had built a big lake, you know, for artificial sea battles, and what they did was Vespasian, the people knew that Nero was very unpopular, so they filled in his lake and they built the Colosseum instead, on the place where he built this artificial lake for naval battles. But anyway, that's has to do with temple treasure and Jewish charity. But that was going on 19 centuries later, 18 centuries later. And, you know, the people living in Jerusalem, there was a Jewish community in Jerusalem at this time. People say, oh, you know, the Jews have stolen the Arab land. You know, again, they have no idea of history. The situation in Palestine was very bad. It was a malarial swamp. It had been depopulated over the centuries. You can look at the pictures of the British artists in the 1820s and 30s who go through here and painted romantic pictures. It's almost totally deserted except for a few towns, Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And, you know, other than that, it's like totally almost deserted swamp. The Jews drained the swamps in Galilee at a cost of tremendous malaria and so on and so forth to build their settlements, and they negotiated for the land. They bought the land from absentee landlords. There was no eviction of peasants from the land because the land wasn't even being used. You know, but all this is the mythology, the stupid propaganda that one hears, and that's all I can call it. It's misinformed propaganda. And if you study it, you'll see that I'm right. In any event, if you look at the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1906, which is the classical edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, I think it's 1906 or 5, they have the article on Palestine and so on and Jerusalem, and they give the population figures. And the Jews were already a majority in Jerusalem in 1906. I think there's 70,000 people or 60,000 people living in Jerusalem, according to the 1905 census or whatever that's given in the Encyclopedia Britannica for that year. The Jews are 40,000, Christians are 10,000, and Muslims are 20,000. Something to that effect. You know, and nobody would believe that. Nobody would even imagine that the Jews, how were the Jews a majority back in 1905 already, before Zionism even started? Sadaqah Jews. Jews were being supported by charity from abroad and went to Jerusalem and settled. And that was probably going on all through the 18th, 19th centuries. And probably earlier in the expulsion from Spain period, they went to northern Palestine, Galilee, Safed, did Kabbalah and mysticism and things like that. And Kabbalah is known for its mysticism and so on. But I think from the, you know, probably the Napoleonic period onward, the Jews' influx into Palestine, Jerusalem, they weren't farmers. And here it says it. He says it here, and I think this is it. He was denounced in Jerusalem because those people were living on traditional collections. They were what was called Sadaqah Jews. They were living on charity. And so alms for the pious poor in the Holy Land. In their eyes, the creation of an agricultural settlement in which Jews would have to work with their hands would lead people away from Torah study and open the way to dangerous socialist or other heresies and things like that. Yeah, the rabbinic groups in Jerusalem were totally against the agricultural groups. And so you have to understand this. These are things that are no one even has an inkling about when they talk about the Palestinian situation, the Israeli situation. They don't know the struggles between the Jews themselves or what they were going through. You know, these new kibbutz type or agricultural people who are being trained in agriculture, this was like shocking to these people who all they did all day, you know, pray all day long or study the Talmud. How you can study the Talmud your whole life and wring anything out of it ultimately is beyond my comprehension, frankly, because it, to my mind, is a lot of trivia in that collection of stuff compared to the Bible, but I don't want to get into an argument with my Jewish confreres. Delete that from my statements, please, and do not quote me on that particular score. I have enough arguments and problems in the world. I don't need another one on that one. But I'm not a terrible big fan of the Talmud, and I don't think the kibbutzniks were either, and I don't think people who were wanting to work in agricultural settlements were either. But never mind, the Talmud was good for, did teach people how to study, concentrate, very good for the computer generation, which is why the Israelis are doing very, very well now in the Silicon Valley type of world. And it was very good for people who sat in chairs and, just exercised their brain, if you want to call it that, or their mind over certain puzzling issues. So it was extremely good for that. In other words, they weren't peasants, Peasants are nothing wrong with peasants, but peasants have not been trained in a sophisticated use of their mental faculties to a great extent. It takes several generations to begin to get through those levels of activity. And these guys, they had a head start. They knew languages, they knew everything. So the rabbinic study syndrome certainly is an advantage in any world, just like the Chinese exams for the civil service in Imperial China. Extremely important for producing the Chinese intellectuality that we're all familiar with. Certainly the rabbinic tradition is a plus for the Jews in many ways, but it's a minus socially speaking. These people could not fight, they could not defend themselves, they could not see the Holocaust coming, they could not understand anything that was going, the waves of different emotions that were sweeping Europe. Many of them perished in the camps for that reason. There was no foresight there, there was just a concentration on these traditional activities. And, if we're up to these people in Jerusalem, no state of Israel would ever have been born. They didn't fight the War of Independence. They still don't go into the army, most of them. And there's a huge social anger about that among the people who do serve against the people who don't serve. And all these yeshivas, as they're called, which is what, that's a very good term, yeshiva, means to sit down. That's what they were doing, sitting down. Yoshev, if you know your Aramaic Hebrew, means sit down. And where they sat was where they studied, so it was called a place you sat down. So they sat in yeshivas all their life. And in fact, that's the problem with the Tzadikah Jews. So the Tzadikah Jews were one group of people living in Jerusalem. Nothing wrong with them. They're very pious, very well-meaning to some extent, I'm sure. They're certainly not. They're harmless. They're not harming anybody except themselves, maybe. Socially speaking, they're hated, of course, because they're so different looking. They wear black costumes, and long beards, and peot, and I lived on the West Bank for a while, and all the Arabs would call them curlies. That was their name for them, curlies, because of their peot type. It was always funny. It's, oh, the curlies, you mean? Okay, the curlies. Yeah. And of course, if you read some of the Germans and Hitler and all these other people, I was just reading one of the excerpts, one of the books of these collections that could be endless ones. I was reading Wagner's opinion of the Jews, and he was horrified by their appearance. These horrific people that had to be banned from Germany, as far as he was concerned, and mainly on looks alone, how they looked. Shave the beard and pay off and other things off a Jew, and I think they look more or less like anybody else, as far as their appearance goes. But that's just that would be like judging Amish on the clothes and so on they have, and hating them for that. Anyway, that was a big problem, and you see that this Kalisher is on the side of working in agriculture. Let's look at quickly what he says here before we have a break. Look, the redemption that we long for is not to be imagined as a sudden miracle. All the Jews were saying, the rabbinic Jews, the Talmudic Jews, the religious Jews, the Reformed Jews were saying this all along. We can't do anything to hasten the end time, to bring about the so-called last days, to bring about the ingathering. This has to be done by the Messiah. We have to wait for the Messiah. And of course, the Christian second coming of Jesus, that never occurs, and the Jewish Messiah never comes either. The reason why, this is a handy way to keep people focused on the future. These things never materialize, and unless there's human effort, nothing ever gets done. Nothing ever gets done. So if the Jews are going to wait for the Messiah to bring them back to Palestine, guess what? They'll wait forever. They'll wait forever. So guys like Kalisher were saying, hey, come on, this is ridiculous. You know, we have to get, you know, I'm putting it in a more sophisticated way than I am. You know, we have to, you know, look at this with clear eyes. The Almighty, blessed be He, and Jews always say, blessed be He like that, will not suddenly descend from on high and command His people to go forth. He will not send the Messiah from heaven in a twinkling of the eye. That's quite radical, you see, for 1862 to be saying this. To sound the trumpet for the scattered of Israel and gather them. That was what the religious felt. That's what, you know, we don't have to do anything, we just wait for the Messiah. Well, you'll wait, and you'll wait, and you'll wait. See, what was different about the 19th century than previous times for Jewish existence is you had the transportation and communications developing. Unfortunately, it also developed to make the eradication of them possible, too. You had the transportation and communications developing that could bring this about on a mass level. Prior to the 19th century, prior to the 19th century and railroads and things like that, you didn't have that kind of thing. And now, of course, this is just accelerated with what? Jet planes, and the reason why you have a huge inundation of all countries of immigration from every part of the earth is the ease of access of transportation. If you were to come from East Asia to America back in the 19th century, you know, you'd have to undergo a grueling 3 or 4 month ocean voyage, and you probably wouldn't even have the money to pay for it. You'd have to indenture yourself. Was what they did. The first Chinese immigrants here to America indentured themselves to people in Hong Kong who were willing to take a portion of their wages as, you know, for subsidizing their passage. That's how the Chinese originally came to San Francisco and so on. So I mean, the modern transportation made these things more possible. Steamships, railroads, and now of course jet plane is what people are coping with now. And Europe is really finding this to be a hard go. You know, I don't know what their answer is going to be, but I knew, I watched the jet plane come in. I was in Paris when the first jet flights occurred, and you could see something was changing in the world. It not only changed in the fact of tourism, that huge masses of people from Europe went down to places, sunny places like Rhodes or Greece or even the South Pacific, and they had their social programs that would pay for them to go on these things. So then you had Club Meds developing all over the place and so on. The jet plane ruined all places that you had to, you know, work hard to get to. Greece became ruined. Southern Spain was ruined as far as these places just became tourist, you know, watering holes. And you really, the days that I traveled these places, they were a real pleasure to visit, believe me, real pleasure to see. And now, the best thing I can do is basically stay home, you know, not go anywhere. I did go out to Tahiti recently, and that was a horror show. That's all I can tell you. You know, that was a real horror show. You know, the prices as well as what was available for that kind of a thing. And I'm sure Tahiti and Van Gogh and Gauguin's day was really something interesting. Anyway, he will not surround the holy city with a wall of fire or cause the holy temple to descend from the heavens like the prophets or others speak about. The bliss and miracles that were promised by his servants, the prophets, like I just said, will come to pass. Everything will be fulfilled, but we will not run in terror and flight. For the redemption of Israel will come by slow degrees, and the ray of deliverance will shine forth gradually. My dear reader, cast aside the conventional view that the Messiah will suddenly sound a blast and a great trumpet and cause all the inhabitants of earth to tremble. On the contrary, he means by redemption the ingathering of the exiles. The redemption will begin by awakening support among the philanthropists. There it is. And by gaining control of the nations to the gathering of some of the scattered of Israel, and by gaining the consent, rather, of the nations, League of Nations, to the gathering of some of the scattered of Israel into the Holy Land. Well, he's got the whole thing right there. He got the whole thing there. And what year? This is exactly what happened. And this is what? 1862. So don't think Zionism began with Theodor Herzl or people like that in 1900. No, it was already perking away. That's why I really like reading an excerpt from something. He quotes Isaiah because he's, you know, he's appealing to a biblically minded audience. So we give this quote from Isaiah. He thus revealed that all Israel would not return from exile at one time, but would be gathered by degrees as the grain is slowly gathered by beaten corn. And so on and so forth. Then he has this little essay on page 113 of the holiness of labor of work, holiness of the work ethic. There are many who will refuse to support the poor of the Holy Land by saying we should. So why should we support? That's tzedakah, charity. By the way, remember, you people who know your New Testament, when Paul reports in Galatians, his meeting with James to present the good news as he presents it among the Gentiles, among the nations. James agrees, according to Paul, I'm not sure he did or didn't agree, but that's what Paul's presentation. James agrees to let Paul go and do all this stuff that he's doing out there on one condition. What is it? Don't forget to remember the poor. Meaning the community in Jerusalem called themselves the poor. That is the tzedakah Jews. Even then. Don't forget to remember the poor out in the diaspora. I'm not talking about that. Send your contributions up. You want to go to these new areas? Okay. You want to farm out these new areas to your new way of doing things? You think Gentiles are interested in this stuff? Okay. Send the contributions. And you remember Paul, if you read Paul's letters, before he goes to Jerusalem, he's running around like a madman. What's he getting? From his different communities in Thessalonica and other places that he's put down in Corinth and Thessalonica and Asia Minor, contributions. And he's setting one community against the other so he can have enough money when he goes up to Jerusalem to have enough clout that people will not give him a hard time up there. He's not going up to Jerusalem without money in his pocket, I assure you. He's going up after a long absence to show how successful he's been and to do what James told him to do, remember the poor. And what's the first thing, according to Acts, that happens to Paul when he comes up to Jerusalem and the people in the community, not the Jews generally, but in the movement, whatever the movement was called at that time, wasn't called Christianity yet. What's the first thing that happens to him? James says, there's a speech, and Acts is quoting it verbatim, and now we're in the we document in Acts, which is pretty accurate. A we document cut in Acts in chapter 16. This is in chapter 21, if you know your Acts. And what does James say to Paul? He said, but you see, Paul, there are some who have heard that you preach straying from the law and against the temple and things, and do not regularly observe the traditions of the ancestors. But Paul, to show that there's no truth to the rumors that they have heard, we want you to go into the temple and take a Nazirite oath upon yourself and pay for the Nazirite oath and for other penitents that we have here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Nazirite oath was a slightly costly procedure. You had to pay for various things connected to it, sacrifices, priestly activities, and so on and so forth. And that's an obscure portion of Jewish law for Paul to show that he still regularly observed the law. So James put this penance on him. Why would he do this? Well, James knows very well that Paul is not keeping the law, and is not advising others to keep the law, and in fact, as the people say at one point when they see him in the temple, this is the man that preaches against this place, against the law, and against our people all over Asia, which is exactly right, even according to Acts' presentation of the situation in Paul's own letters. And there's a riot occurs on the Temple Mount. The Roman soldiers have to come in and save him. What was your point?
I was just going to ask, the reason he told them to go into the temple is because he knew the people of the temple would kill him, right?
Well, no, that's Brandon's view. That's Ron has gotten that probably from SGF Brandon. That's Brandon's view that James is deliberately setting Paul up for not killing him.
Or that he just wanted him to pay for these other
No, I think he wanted to show him up that, if he was willing to, be a hypocrite and to show that he did regularly observe the law, just make a public statement. And, since he was conceived, I don't think James knew there was going to be a riot in the temple and stuff like that. But people who knew him from what he was doing in other places, see him come in the temple there and knew that he was what he was doing. But the point is that Paul, you see, is nothing loath. He's willing to do this. But what I'm trying to emphasize is not Paul's positives or negatives. I'm trying to emphasize the fact that he's considered to have money that he can afford to pay for 4 others. He's brought the contributions up, he's brought the sub-income up. So, you know, I'm just trying to show how this goes back 1800 years. You know, that's what I'm looking at. Okay. There are many who refuse to support the poor of the Holy Land by saying, why should we support people who choose idleness or lazy and not interested in working and prefer to depend upon the Jews of the diaspora to support them? That's perfect. That's exactly what people in Palestine were saying. I'm sure this is an argument put forth by Satan. You know, and this is not right. The people of Palestine are students of the Torah, and they're unaccustomed from their youth to physical labor. Most of them come from distant shores, risking their very lives for the privilege of living in the Holy Land. In their eyes, etc., they must turn to their philanthropic brethren. So there's nothing wrong. So he's very balanced, you see. So now, let's silence this argument once and for all. I would suggest that an organization be established to encourage settlement in the Holy Land for the purpose of purchasing and cultivating farms and vineyards. Such a program would appear as a ray of deliverance to those now living in the land in poverty and famine, and the pittance that is gathered from the apartment. This is a really important essay, you see. That's why I asked you to read these texts, because, you know, you want to get a real feel of what's going on. Read the texts themselves. Don't listen to what scholars say, or I say, or other academics say, you know. This tells you the whole thing, you know, and this guy is really, clearly, a very clever man, and knows what is going on. He doesn't want to insult the religious people who are. He says, "Look, these people aren't fit for work. You know. You want to get people who get the land and restore it and revivify it and get rid of the malaria swamps and do something. You know, set up a school, set up an agricultural school. The situation would be different if we were inspired by the fervor of working the land with our own hands. God would then bless our labor. There, we don't need to import grain and pay for it with tzedakah from Egypt and other neighboring countries. Our harvest would prosper. Once the Jews in the Holy Land began to eat of their own produce, the financial aid of the diaspora wouldn't really be necessary. It wouldn't be sufficient. We wouldn't need a lot more. Another great advantage of agricultural settlement is that we would have the privilege of observing the religious commandments. So he's appealing to the religious people too. We can, you see, there are commandments that have to do with working the soil in the Torah of Moses. So he's saying, look, we could observe the commandments. But beyond all this, Jewish farming would be a spur to ultimate messianic redemption. That's why I read this guy first. And no one's ever heard of this guy, except in this book. This would bring the Messiah, you people who are into messianism. No stubborn opponent of these thoughts maintain that those who labor day and night be taken away from the study of the Torah, you know, okay. If there will be bread in the land, people will then be able to study with more attention. In addition, we are sure that there are many in the Holy Land who are not students of the Torah and who long to work the land. These will support the physically infirm scholars to whom no man would dare say work the land, but to whom all would say that they should devote themselves entirely to serving the Lord. So fine, okay. Let the able-bodied people go and work the land, and let the people who want to study the Torah and the Talmud, let them keep on studying. One will help support the other. Such a policy would also raise our dignity among the nations. They would say the children of Israel too have the will to redeem the land of their ancestors, which is barren and forsaken. He knows that Palestine is barren and forsaken. I don't listen to the Palestinian arguments. You say, well, how did so many Palestinians get there? Because there was a regular British administration in 1918, and there was no control kept on the immigration of Palestinians. They came in from the inland borders, not from the sea. This vast Palestinian immigration into Palestine. And there was a flourishing because of the economic situation, because of the Zionist influx of funds and finance into the country that attracted people from all over the neighboring Arab world. So the Jewish immigration produced a huge Arab immigration into Palestine, not an emigration. So you just look at the censuses and so on, and you can see it. Anyway, I'm not trying to get into politics on these issues, but you know, it's really important, you know, not to be, you know, anyone who studies it, you know, would understand what went on here. But the average person just listens to slogans, and more slogans, and more slogans, and we get deeper into hatred, misunderstanding, and war. Why do the people of Italy and other countries sacrifice their lives? This is the Risorgimento, the time of the Garibaldi and these people, for the land of their fathers. Why can't we take inspiration from Italy? While we, like men bereft of strength and courage, do nothing? What, are we a bunch of cowardly, you know, uncourageous, without any strength or dignity? Are we inferior to peoples who have no regard for life and fortunes compared with love of their land and nation? So look, we just had in 1848 The Hungarians, let us take examples of the Italians, the Poles, the Hungarians who laid down their lives in struggle for national independence. You see, nationalism was sweeping Europe in the mid-19th century. We should not be ashamed of ourselves. All the other peoples have striven only for the sake of their own national honor. How much more should we exert ourselves for our duty to labor, not only for the glory of our ancestors, but for the glory of God who chose us? That's a lovely essay, toward 1860, of call to arms and so on and so forth. And you have to see, I hate to keep bringing modern things, but, we hear about questioning the Jewish right and all this sort of thing. Does anyone question whether Hungary should exist, Iceland should exist, Norway should exist? Does anyone question whether Poland should exist, whether Czechoslovakia should exist, whether Italy should exist? Why is it only the Jews who are questioned? The Arabs should have 22 states and you can't have one Jewish state? I mean, this is just insanity to my mind. Total and complete insanity. And yet I hear people all the time talking like this, and there's nothing I personally can say, except that the people at large and who are intelligent and studied should raise their conscious level and stop falling for all this sloganeering and ill-informed actual incitement to riot and murder and killing. And I just can't understand. I agree, the Kurds should have a country too. I'm all for it. I think that they should. I don't see any reason why the Kurds should be frozen out of a country, but I don't see why the Jews of all people are questioning why they should have a country. Okay, I'll break here.